I change your bum life. You fight me, it's a celebration.
I would beat you.
When you sign to fight me, it's a celebration. You ring back home, you ring your wife. Baby, we done it. We're rich, baby. Conor McGregor made us rich. Break out the red panties.
Yo, 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 welcome back to the fifth round. As always, your boy Stephen Moustaris, and little Gracie back there, as always, is the greatest co-host of all time. But guys, with 2022 coming to an end and the UFC finishing up their schedule this year, I kind of just wanted to sit back and, just kind of look back at this evolution that we've seen of this sport. It's been fucking crazy. Like, to even think when I think I'm about to be going on 18 years as a fan of UFC and MMA in general. And dude, I remember back in the day when it took like 4 or 5 fights just in the UFC and like really good performances to even start getting your name hyped up and to even start getting into those main cards, main events. And then nowadays with like the social media just taking over and, knockouts going viral, it's been really cool to be watching all these fights, all these organizations you never even heard of, but you're seeing these tornado kick knockouts or the double knockouts and all these crazy things. And it's even allowing the sport to become bigger. And I know it's the fastest growing sport in the world. And it's just been so cool to see. And like even other large promotions like Bellator and One Championship and at PFL and all these other ones, you're starting to see these guys starting to get their own name for themselves and not just being in the UFC to get a name. So we're starting to see all these debuts of these fighters and everything, and people are starting to be hyped up for them instead of, like I said, the mid to late 2000s when I was a real big fan, like starting to love it. It's like, dude, it took you, like I said, man, 4 or 5 fights to really get your name out there and even start talking about becoming a main card fighter. And there in pay-per-views were only 2 great fights, and now we're all fucking dialed in on prelims, early prelims, because we got an 18-year-old fighter like Raul Roses Jr. at UFC 282. So with all this being said, I wanted to do something pretty cool. I decided to go with the top 10 greatest UFC debuts of all time by fighters 21 and under. At number 10, Carlos Newton. On May 15th, 1998, at UFC 17 Redemption, and yeah, I don't know if you guys remember, but the UFC used to come up with some god-awful names for their pay-per-view, and I guess, to be fair to them, Redemption isn't too bad, but if you guys go look at some of them back in the day, wow. But UFC 17, Carlos Newton, 21 years old, make UFC debut against Bob Gilstrap. And I know most of you guys are probably sitting here like, who the fuck's Bob Gilstrap? This is your uncle getting off a 9 to 5, and if he's fighting somebody, it's like this Carlos Newton who's just working on submissions all day, like, it's not gonna go well. But within 8 seconds of the very first round, Carlos Newton gets a nasty double leg takedown, gets instantly in the mount, and then holds the arm bar from the 20-second mark onto about the 40-second mark where he transitions into a triangle, causing Bob to tap within 53 seconds. Now, I know you guys are sitting here like, man, that's not that great of a debut, and wow, I'm about to turn this off. What makes this so impressive is not only is this back in the day when there was only one 12-minute round with no breaks, and if it made it past the 12 minutes, you guys got a 1-minute rest period, and then it was a 3-minute playoff period. Well, not only that, but this same night, UFC 17, this was the middleweight Grand Prix, which back in the day you got to fight more than once a night if you kept winning. Well, this is where it gets impressive. He makes pretty much in his debut night, he's got to fight twice, and his second opponent is Dan Henderson. And yeah, I know it's technically not his debut fight, it would have been against Bob Gilstrap, but what makes this so impressive, not only is Dan Henderson known as Hollywood back in the day, which I thought was really funny, but this fight, it was like way before its time. You guys go back and watch it. It's such a grueling fight. The first like 4 minutes, you got Carlos Newton getting the best of Dan Henderson, and he gets gassed, and then Dan Henderson gives him the most of it, and then Dan Henderson get gassed, and Carlos Newton comes back, and they fight in one of the most grueling fights you'll ever watch. It goes all 15 minutes, and it ends into a split decision loss for Carlos Newton. And at this time, Dan Henderson, I think, is only like 3-1, so it's not that impressive at the time, but looking back at it now, you're like, wow, Carlos Newton just did that shit against Dan Henderson, who goes on to become one of the greatest fighters of all time. And I know if you go back and look at Carlos Newton's career, it only ends, I think, 16-14. I know it's not that impressive, but to fight 2 times in one night on your UFC debut at only 21 years old, that's really fucking impressive. Number 9, Cameron Simon. So at UFC 282, not only did we get the premiere of Raul Roses Jr. at 18 years old, but we also had some wild finishes. Leah Tapira against Bryce Mitchell. We had the entire judging tobacco. But Cameron Simon made his UFC debut at just 21 years old. And what kind of makes this so impressive is the fact not only does he get a last-second replacement, but his replacement is probably better than his original opponent, and Steven Kozlow. Guess what makes this so impressive is this dude's got one of the craziest nicknames of all time. So his first nickname he gave himself, Obi-Wan Shinobi, which I mean is always fucking sweet. Also, another one that's just kind of scary, even though it's pretty soft, but it's the pillow, which was given to him by his training partners and his coach for just how great he is at putting people to sleep. And if you go look at this guy's Sure Dog or Tapology or whatever, like, this man's got all 6 wins, first round submission, just absolutely nuts. And I know we're sitting here, Cameron Simon's probably not the most well-known name, but he has been making a lot of noise fighting out of South Africa and just becoming the man with him and Dricus du Plessis coming up. So what makes this fight so fucking impressive, and I'm sorry I couldn't use footage because it's so recent, I'll probably get this banned. So what makes it so impressive, if you guys go back and watch that fight, not only is it just absolutely grueling, you can kind of tell the nerve, play some play into it, but it's just the fact that they both get their opportunities in the fight, and the fact that Cameron Simon's got to defend every fucking submission in the book, and then not only does he start getting his stand-up going, you know, it was really cool to see him finish that in the 3rd round and just how bad he wanted it. So that's the reason I got a number 9. It was pretty impressive, and yeah, I know the name's not that high, but watch out for the kid. He's going to be freaking good. Number 8, Charles do Bronx Oliveira. Alright, so I'm really testing your guys' knowledge now. So who remembers when the UFC used to be on Versus? I honestly almost forgot, but the only reason I really remember this fight card is because I was such a huge fan of Jon Jones at the time. And this was the fight that he headlined where he fought Vladimir Matyushenko, and one of the most lopsided fights you'll ever see. But you guys go back on August 1st, 2010 at UFC Live 2. The second fight of the night actually is the debut of Charles do Bronx Oliveira at only 20 years old. And he takes on Darren Elkins, who, yeah, I know we're sitting here now like, come on, Stephen, really? How impressive a win is that? It's Darren Elkins. We're watching him all the time now in 2022, just getting finished left and right and becoming like, it's almost like those memes back in WWE where Ric Flair used to be bleeding all the time. That's like Darren Elkins now. It's like, man, he's just a punching bag. He's a human punching bag now at this rate. But if we flash back in 2010, this kid was 12-1 going into this fight, and Charles do Bronx made UFC debut at 12-0. It's like both of these guys were finishing everyone. I think they each split, I think it was 6 knockouts and 5 submissions, and Darren Elkins' only loss was 2 years before that in a wild barn burner. What are the odds? Everybody was expecting Darren Elkins to just use his wrestling. Within the first 20 seconds, he gets a major slam on Charles do Bronx, but man, within 30 seconds, Charles do Bronx, probably one of his best submissions in the UFC, which is saying a lot. Which is his first fight, and he's got so many submissions, but boy, does he have a nasty arm bar / triangle, absolutely fucking nasty, and finishes it at 41 seconds. And at 20 years old, man, I don't care who you are, to get a finish like that is just nasty. And at the time, Darren Elkins was just going on a rampage. Number 7, Nick Diaz. On September 26th of 2003, a UFC 44 Undisputed, which, again, not too terrible of a name, but I promise some of them are bad, but at UFC 44, not only do we see the debut of Nick Diaz, but we also have an absolute stat card. If you guys go back to look, we got Hermes Frank on the card, Kawal Uno, Josh Thompson, Karo Parisian, Randy Couture, Tito Ortiz, Andrei Arlovsky, Vladimir Matyushenko, Tim Sylvia, Jorge Rivera, Rich Franklin even. I mean, it's a stacked card, but at the time, what makes it so impressive for Nick Diaz is not only is he only 20 years old coming into this fight, but what's so crazy is he's also fighting his like arch nemesis at the time in Jeremy Jackson. And if you guys don't know who Jeremy Jackson is, I really feel like he just missed his time in MMA by like a hair. I just felt like the fight game wasn't as popular at the time. These guys didn't get the exposure that they deserved, but he's got some crazy wins over not only Nick Diaz, finishing him within the first round, but he's got a win over Shoney Carter. He fought Jake Shields in a very close fight, fought Joe Daddy Stevenson in a close fight. Like, he fought the who's who back in the day. These guys were all fighting each other left and right, and man, the dude was so talented, and I just feel like he just literally just missed his spotlight by 5 seconds. But a year before this, nearly 5 days to the exact date, a year before this, they fought for the very first time, where Jeremy Jackson finished Nick Diaz. Yeah, finished Nick Diaz within, it was like 43 seconds of the very first round, TKO. And then they fought only 2 months before this fight, and Nick Diaz getting the win in the first round submission. So going into UFC 44, they both signed to the UFC, and their trilogy fight is their debut for the UFC, which the fight isn't as great as you might think back like in the day for Nick Diaz especially, but it was more of a dominant performance by Nick Diaz, getting takedowns at will. You can definitely tell in the beginning Jeremy Jackson has the hands, man, rocks Nick Diaz a couple times, Nick rocks him a couple times. It is a back and forth fight, just Nick Diaz is ultimately getting takedown after takedown and winning a unanimous decision win. But for him being only 20 years old, beating a guy that's already beat him once, coming back, beating him twice, and for them to fight 3 times in 1 year, I just think that's absolutely ridiculous. And, and then clearly Nick Diaz goes on to be the man, Nick Diaz Army. Everybody's following, everybody loves him. So I thought that was number 7. It was just an impressive performance. Number 6, Sage Northcutt. All right, so I know most of you guys are shaking your head right now, like, really, Sage Northcutt's on here? Like, come on now. We all know he was a fraud and all that, whatever. And he wasn't what the UFC hyped him up to be. But in all fairness, at this time, at UFC 192, Sage Northcutt was coming into this fight 5-0 with all 5 finishes, just looking phenomenal, looking like a promising star at just 19 years old. And he takes on Francisco Trevino, who I also, at the time, I'm sitting here now, I remember this fight just being so lopsided, but I didn't realize that he had that great of a record. Francisco came into this fight with 12-1, and he had like 9 finishes, knockouts, and this dude was pretty fucking scary. He just lost his first fight right before this by a unanimous decision, didn't get rocked or nothing. I just remember this fight though being really weird at UFC 192, where I remember Francisco, like, he just always had that look on him where he was just like didn't want to be there. With that being said, I just remember Sage Northcutt coming out with just the karate style side kicks, throwing him up, throwing high, low, and then just absolutely catching him on one of the kicks. And then what makes this so impressive is not only the like 50 punch combo that he throws, but when he's got him rocked against the cage and having, you know, the IQ at 19 years old to not get too crazy, and because he was throwing from the hip on some of these hooks, but he also got the takedown and then end up finishing Trevino with some nasty elbows at just like 52 seconds in the first round. And with that being said, man, it was just such an incredible performance. I don't care who you are. If you're 19 years old and you go out there and do something like that to somebody who's 12-1, and I guess he goes on to be just, he finishes his career 13-3. He only fights 2 more times after this fight, but still, there was no shock when you look back at that first fight of why he was so hyped up. Number 5, Jon Jones. All right, so on August 9, 2008 at UFC 87, or also known as Seek and Destroy, not only do we get the GSP just outclassing of John Fitch, and also one of the greatest clips of all time where Brock Lesnar tackles Heath Herring, but we also get one of the greatest sound clips of all time from Joe Rogan.
Guzman, or black guy Jones, white guy Guzman.
But I really feel like people don't remember that this fight, or this clip, is actually from the Jon Jones-Andre Guzman fight. At the time, Andre Guzman's 5-0, at looking very impressive, 31 years old, looking like, you know, I'm hungry, it's about his prime. And you got a young 21-year-old Jon Jones coming in. And what makes this so impressive is not the performance, I guess. It's more so the fact that he's only been training for 9 months at this rate. And if you go back and look, this man rattled off all 6 of his wins within literally like a 6-month period. 9 months training, just starts fighting because he's that talented at wrestling. JUCO champion, we all know this and everything. But Jon Jones, this is the great thing about this fight, is you can see the evolution all within him. Like, he's got some terrible striking at this time, at least for high-level MMA. He's still kicking all of our asses, and especially how he was a very aggressive fighter, but his stand-up was terrible in this fight, and you can kind of see it coming together by the end of the 3rd round. And, you know, he has a nasty takedown in the 1st round and a couple in the 2nd, and of course finishes off in the 3rd. But, you know, the glimpses of showing how great he is, but at the same time, it's showing glimpses of, like, way. He could have been a middle of the road guy by his talent in this first fight. But also for you Jon Jones haters, you also get some dabbles of some nut shots in here that almost call the fight for him. So what makes it so impressive, like I said, is just the 9-month training and the fact that he beats a 5-0 Andre Guzman, and Andre Guzman literally only fights 3 more times after this beating. He takes such a bad beating in this fight. So not the greatest performance, I guess, like on this list, but it's just really impressive to see how the GOAT really evolved his game, because you can't just say steroids and stuff. You got to go watch this guy's technique. It is kind of bad when we're talking Muay Thai kickboxing for high level. And then he becomes one of the greatest strikers. Shouldn't say one of the greatest strikers, but one of the most technical strikers out there. But this is why I have him here. Number 4, Mohammed Makhachev. All right, so back just a couple months ago on March 19th of 2022, at one of the craziest cards of the year, if not the craziest card of the year, at UFC London at the O2 Arena, where we saw every single fighter from the UK win that night. I remember Paul Craig led it off, getting the dub, Molly McCann, Meatball Molly getting the victory, Patty the Baddie getting a dub, Allen getting a dub, Aspinall getting the dub. So I remember it just being a crazy night. But the very first fight of the night, a young 21-year-old Mohammed Makhachev, as he took on Cody Durden in one of the most impressive finishes you'll see. So a little backstory. Mohammed Makhachev just makes it at 21. He's just a couple days away from his birthday. I think literally a month and a half away from his birthday at this time to be 22. And to be fair to him, he was supposed to have a fight in the UFC a couple months before that, but it got canceled. But then, so he finally gets to fight Cody Durden, who at the time is just an absolute dog. He's 12-3 at this time. No slouch whatsoever. Great wrestler. Just had a draw with Chris Gutierrez just a year before this, and Chris Gutierrez, as everybody know, the guy who just absolutely sent Frankie Edgar into the shadow realm. But still, very good high-level fight here. Mohammed Makhachev, I think he was literally only 6-0 at this time. These guys are dancing for about 40 seconds, and then Makhachev just lands one of the nastiest flying knees you'll see and just instantly catches him into a guillotine. And Durden tries a big slam, but Makhachev holds on to the guillotine and gets it done within literally a 58-second mark, just before the minute mark. And one of the most impressive finishes ever. And then not to mention he goes on to win 2 straight in the rest of the year in dominant fashion. And the fact Cody Durden went on to win 2 more as well. So it just for him to do that to somebody who's had 15 fights going into this fight, literally doesn't get finished like that and goes on to still win 2 huge fights in the UFC, man, that shit's impressive. And I think he's one to watch here very soon. This guy's going to be a champ here probably the next 2 or 3 years. Number 3, Raul Roses Jr. All right, did you think I was going to leave this out? Let's be honest here. The only reason I don't have this at number 1 is because just of the talent level of the next 2 guys that won. But at UFC 282, 18-year-old Raul Roses Jr. takes on Jay Perrin in one of the biggest fight slots that you could possibly be in the headliner at the prelims of the pay-per-view. Like, that's a huge fight. That's where Sugar Sean O'Malley's made his name. It's where a lot of people have made their name. Paddy the Baddy. It's a lot of people have made their name here in this spot. So for him to get this fight, his very first fight in the UFC, is just absolutely ridiculous. Good for him. And if we wanted to consider the Dana White Contender Series win on here for his UFC debut, then it would technically be 17 years. But I personally don't count it. I think it's awesome. Don't get me wrong. I think it should count on your record, but it's technically not the UFC yet. So not only does he go in there and just absolutely dominant performance, doesn't even get touched. His takedowns are ridiculous. He looks strong as fuck. Doesn't even actually get a legitimate submission. Just a face crank. Must show how strong he is for Jay Perrin to just completely quit. What makes this so damn impressive is really it's the fact that you're 18 and you're going into a fucking packed house like this who everybody's screaming your name. You got the sombrero coming out. The man has so much pressure on him. I couldn't even imagine. But like, I think what helps him is his ignorance of his age, I guess. Like, I feel like if he's 22, 23 at this rate, maybe the spotlight on him is like he's a little more capable of digesting it more and being like, oh fuck, this is a very big moment. But the fact that he's so young, I think helps him just kind of just shoot the nerves out. So for him to go out there and not only get a dub in 2 minutes and 44 seconds, which is ridiculous, but he becomes the youngest kid to ever win in the UFC, youngest kid to ever fight in the UFC. Just mad impressive. Shouts out to him. And before I name my final 2, I did just want to give some honorable mentions, but still just some phenomenal performances. Number 1, Michael McDonald versus Edwin Figueroa. Number 2, Chase Hooper versus Daniel Tamer. Number 3, Robbie Lawler versus Aaron Riley at UFC 37, High Impact, at just 19 years old. Number 2, Dustin Poirier. January 1st of 2011 at UFC 125, also known as Resolution, we get the very first card that the UFC ever puts on after purchasing WEC just a month before this, where we get to see every 145, every 135 pounder come on over and fight. What makes this fight so fucking impressive, and for those of you sitting there asking who is Josh Crispy, well, this guy comes into this fight against Dustin Poirier 14-1 with 10 huge wins under 1 minute of the very first round, like 4 submissions, 6 TKOs, and not to mention that he beats Jens Pulver just before this in 30 seconds. If you guys know Jens Pulver, that guy is a dog. And then he also beats Mark Hominick, who also just absolute killer. He beats him in 2 minutes and just absolutely dominant. So Josh Crispy goes into 125, so dominant, and he was actually supposed to fight Jose Aldo for the championship, but Jose Aldo got hurt, and Josh Crispy, still wanting to fight, takes on a young Dustin Poirier coming in 8-1 on his career with no big wins, and the only big fight he had, he actually lost to Danny Castillo. Going into this fight, Josh Crispy's definitely favored to win. Dude's very good on the ground, takedown submissions, good at it all, just crazy pressure. But from the very first bell, this man, Dustin Poirier, puts on one of his greatest performances of his career, and if you guys haven't watched this fight, please go back and watch this. Dustin Poirier, from the very beginning, just showing off the boxing, the teep kicks, the unrelying pressure. I'm talking, this man, even like 2 minutes into the very first round, this guy has like a combination on the fence where it's classic DP, throwing his hand, throwing the hook, smacking him, getting the elbows in, getting knees in. I'm talking, he probably hits him with like 30 unanswered, and Josh Crispy instantly is sitting there like, oh my god, what did I get myself into? Dustin Poirier just goes on to just absolutely outclass him in the first round, stuffing every takedown, destroying him on the stand-up, and then round 2, basically the same. Watching this fight, man, Dustin Poirier's knees are fucking ridiculous in this fight. Dude is a fucking monster, just destroying Josh Crispy. He almost finishes him actually in the second round, and I bet you if you ask DP now, he would definitely be like, oh, I should have finished that motherfucker years ago. Third round, he continues to beat his ass, but finally at the like midway point of the third round, Josh Crispy finally gets a takedown, threatening submissions, but DP does a great job and holds on to the rest of the fight. Not only does DP get the unanimous decision win, but he beats Josh Crispy's ass so bad that Josh only goes on to fight 3 more times in the UFC, and you could tell in all 3 of those fights that he lost all of his confidence because of Dustin Poirier. So Josh Crispy goes from being one of the best fighters coming from WEC ever, might have actually gave Jose Aldo problems. We've seen how Mark Hominick gave Aldo problems with takedowns, and man, this guy, I know MMA math doesn't always add up, but Josh Crispy's takedowns at the time former Khabib level. This guy was so good, and if he goes on to beat Jose Aldo that night, Grisby might be what we think of Aldo now. Like, that guy was that good. So Dustin Poirier is in charge, literally is at fault for destroying this guy's career and his name. So one of the greatest performances ever, and I mean, clearly DP goes on to have one of the greatest careers that we've ever seen. Number 1, Vitor Belfort. Hands down, without a doubt, number 1, without any argument whatsoever, is Vitor Belfort for what he did at UFC 12, also known as Judgment Day. So on February 7th of 1997, 19-year-old Vitor Belfort, who literally just made his MMA debut 2 months before this, comes into the UFC for his debut against Trey Telligman, who's no slouch at this rate. This guy was jacked as fuck, had really good submissions, was 3-0 at the time, 32-year-old fighting Vitor, and literally within a minute and 17 seconds, Vitor Belfort's got the iconic 17-punch combos. He probably pulls off 3 of them. He gets Trey basically just diving at his legs. He's so afraid at this rate, hitting him with the power. Rains down some of the meanest elbows you'll ever seen, and just gets Trey to completely tap out due to strike. Also, not to mention, he goes on and fights a second time. Literally 2 fights later. He only gets 1 fight in between this, so probably not even 30 minutes in real time later, he goes on and fights Scott Ferozzo and knocks him out in 43 seconds. And then if you want to add on a little bit, 2 months later, he goes out and knocks out Tank Abbott in 52 seconds. So I don't care if he beat our uncles who are literally just getting off their shift, installing your heating and cooling. So still, for him to be 19 years old, to go in here and to beat 2 guys at a combined record of 7-1 at just 19 years old. I don't care who you are. That is fucking impressive. And he rattles off 3 wins in a year for the UFC, 2 in one night, rattles off against Tank Abbott. And at the end of the year, he actually ends up losing to Randy Couture. But at just 19 years old, this kid did so much. And then not to mention what Vitor goes on to do. I mean, good God. I mean, hands down, without a doubt, number 1. I don't care if you just fought 1 time in the night, 2 times in the night, but at 19 years old, to do that, to knock out these big boys and only be 1-0, and then to have your career that you had for how long? Without a doubt, number 1. So that is my list, guys. If you guys like that, please do whatever you want. Comment if you guys don't agree. I mean, if you guys didn't even know these fights, because I didn't know a couple of these. I really had to do some deep research, so it was a lot of fun, and hopefully I did a good job. I'm sure I'll watch this and laugh at my own list and be like, man, you should have rearranged, but it's been an absolute great time. And guys, be on the lookout. I'm going to be coming up with some of the greatest knockouts of the year, greatest finishes, you know, all the shit that we're probably going to be doing. Probably hand out some awards this year. So thank you guys so much. This has been the 5th round. Stephen Moustaris. Let's go, baby.